Let's now take a look at the evolution of the legislature in Sri Lanka. The legislature in Sri Lanka has been called by many names as the constitutions in Sri Lanka, or the constitutions that amounted to the supreme law in Sri Lanka kept on changing from time to time. Starting from the 1931, the legislature of Sri Lanka was known as the State Council. In 1948, this was changed to the Parliament of Ceylon. The 1972 constitution, or the first republican constitution of Sri Lanka, introduced the National State Assembly, which was the legislature of the country at the time. And finally, in the second republican constitution, the 1978 constitution, Parliament of Sri Lanka was introduced as the legislature of the country, and it continues to function to date. Let's take a look at these different bodies or different legislatures in Sri Lanka in more detail. Firstly, the State Council under the Donamo Constitution, which lasted from 1931 to 1948. The Donamo Constitution effected three fundamental changes. Number one, it abolished communal representation. Number two, it introduced universal adult franchise, and it abolished the existing income and literacy qualifications to vote. Number three, it introduced the State Council, which has both an executive and legislative functions. Let's take a look at the constituency of the State Council under the Donamo Constitution. There were 61 members in the State Council. There were 3 ex officio members who had no voting rights. There were 50 members elected to the State Council based on territorial constituencies, and 8 persons who were nominated by the Governor of Ceylon. The 3 ex officio members in the 61-member State Council were the Chief Secretary, who was responsible for public service, external affairs and defense, the Legal Secretary, responsible for elections and the legal system, and also the Financial Secretary. Let's now take a look at the Parliament of Ceylon under the Soulbury Constitution, which lasted from 1948, since Sri Lanka gained independence, until Sri Lanka became a republic under the first Republican Constitution in 1972. The Soulbury Constitution introduced the Westminster model. The British sovereign remained the nominal head of the executive and the judiciary. Ceylon Order in Council of 1946 established the Parliament of Ceylon. The Parliament comprised of 2 chambers, 1 the House of Representatives and 2 the Senate. The Senate was abolished in 1971. Now, the reasons for implementing the Senate under the Soulbury Constitution can be listed as follows. Firstly, to get the services from eminent and mature persons who would otherwise be prevented from the parliamentary arena. Secondly, to provide for minority interests. And thirdly, the standard of debate and contributions made would improve the political education of people. Fourthly, the fact that the second chambers are an integral feature of almost all vibrant democracies in the world. The composition of the Parliament of Ceylon under the Soulbury Constitution was as follows. The 2 houses, namely the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House of Representatives had 101 members initially. This was later increased to 157 members. Now, out of these members, 95 were elected. After the increment, 151 were elected. 6 members of this body was appointed by the Governor of Ceylon. The Senate had 30 members under the Parliament of Ceylon. 15 were appointed by the House of Representatives and 15 by the Governor General. Let's now take a look at the National State Assembly that was established under the first Republican Constitution of Sri Lanka. Now, this body lasted only from 1972 to 1978, and it was subsequently replaced by the Parliament of Sri Lanka. Now, this parliament was a unicameral house. The constitution was rooted entirely in Sri Lanka and was hailed as a homegrown effort. A key feature was the legal supremacy of the National State Assembly. This constitution did not embody the principle of separation of powers. The unicameral National State Assembly was declared as the supreme instrument of state power in the Republic of Sri Lanka. The National State Assembly exercised, among other powers, the legislative power of the people, the executive power of the people, including defense through the President and the Cabinet of Ministers, and the judicial power of the people through courts and other institutions created by the law. The 1972 Constitution embodied the system of parliamentary executive, where the President was required to act on the advice of the Prime Minister, as it was the Prime Minister who appointed the President. It strengthened the legislative arm of government, as there was no separation of powers or judicial review of legislation. The National State Assembly had 151 members from 1972 to 1977. Between 1977 and 1978, the National State Assembly had 168 members. In the year 1978, the National State Assembly was replaced by the Parliament of Sri Lanka under the Second Republican Constitution, which was passed in 1978. Now, some of the key features of the Second Republican Constitution, or the Parliament of Sri Lanka that was established under this constitution, was the executive presidency in Sri Lanka was introduced through this constitution. The constitution adopted several features from the American and French constitutional traditions while retaining several British features as well. Now, the rationale for the executive presidency was to introduce stability for rapid economic development by providing for strong leadership, an executive freed from the whims and fancies of Parliament, and that would not be easily swayed by pressures from within the legislature or even outside. Many have claimed that the introduction of the executive presidency marked a shift to a more authoritarian form of government than a constitution which makes Parliament the supreme organ of the state. The Second Republican Constitution only allowed for pre-enactment review of legislation, which means that judicial review can only be exercised before the enactment and the law and not after. That is, only a bill can be challenged before the Supreme Court, and it cannot be challenged after it becomes an act. The Parliament of Sri Lanka, as of today, has a total of 225 members. Let's now take a look at some notable constitutional provisions which state that Parliament can make or unmake any laws. Article 4A of the Constitution states, "The sovereignty of the people shall be exercised and enjoyed in the following manner. The legislative power of the people shall be exercised by Parliament, consisting of elected representatives of the people and by the people at a referendum." Article 75 of the Constitution reads, "Parliament shall have power to make laws, including laws having retrospective effect, and repealing or amending any provisions to the Constitution or adding any provision to the Constitution, provided that Parliament shall not make any law, A, suspending the operation of the Constitution or any part thereof, and B, repealing the Constitution as a whole unless such law also enacts a new Constitution to replace it." And that was a basic overview of the fundamentals of parliamentary procedure, both across the world and here in Sri Lanka. We hope you understood this because, as was said at the beginning of the presentation, understanding the parliamentary procedure and gaining political literacy on these matters is important to ensure a brighter future for both you, I, and the entire country as a whole.